Hello, everyone. Come in, come in, come in. Come in the room. I'm so excited for us all to be here. So glad to have you here with us. So excited to be doing some work. Was going to wait a little bit for some people to come in the room. Come in. Just want to thank you guys for coming and tuning in with us today. We have some exciting content, so just want to give you some time to coming through this space, this safe space that we're creating to have some real discussion about some real life stuff that's impacting us today. So just thank you guys for coming in. Just come in the space. I see some people are shuffling through. Excited. I'm excited. Thank you guys for being here. I see there's a couple of people watching, and just want to thank you guys for being here. Thank you for showing up. We have some stuff we really want to get into tonight. I know I've been pestering you online about showing up. If you're here, write something in the comments to let me know, that you're here and that you're present, and that you are ready for this. So grateful to have you. Happy to see people coming through, engaging in this content. Is always a pleasure. Okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I want to welcome you guys today to our breakdown of the documentary by Ava DuVray titled 13th. I am Shamika. I am the Vice President of Operations here at Stand Up for Equity, aka SUFE. We are bringing you guys educational content to let you know what's going on throughout our country regarding inequities and issues related to lack of opportunities, lack of appropriate rights-based operations in our country, where people are having things limited and around their lives that matter, that are going to impact their real everyday lives in this country. So we're here to do some education, and today we really want to educate you guys on the 13th Amendment, and how it has now become such a problematic topic in our culture as it relates to the prison system, the industrial prison complex. So we just want you guys to come in, get settled, take a seat, and let's just get into some things, because this is definitely a time where we want to address the inequities around our rights, as we are continuing to see tragic events happen around the country that are impacting our everyday lives and could potentially impact us and alter our lives as well. So thank you guys for being here. Thank you, Alma. Um, Thank you for being interested. It's so important to have people come in and show an interest. Thank you so much for being here. All right, so 13th is a documentary that was produced and filmed and directed by Ava DuVray. She is the director of Selma, which, again, if you guys haven't watched Selma, which is the story of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, following Martin Luther King's work that he was doing in Selma, please get in tune to that. It's some really great educational, movie. It's like something that you need to watch. It's something that really is going to showcase our history and why are we here today? How did we come here? How did we make it to this place? But this documentary right here, 13th, is talking about the 13th Amendment specifically, and how problematic it has become in our culture, and why we need to have a discussion about it today, why it's relevant to our culture and our community, because this stuff is real and it's happening to people in our everyday lives. For some of you, like myself, I definitely have family or have had family in the prison system. um, we know what that life is like and how hard it can be. But what we didn't know is that the system was really rigged against us from the beginning. Whether you have family or you yourself are in prison, we are being impacted every day. So this is something that we need to be focused on. This documentary definitely shined a light on the problems and inequities surrounding our right to freedom. And this is important that we discuss it today. All right, so I've titled these slides A Broken System, primarily because we are talking about a system of inequity. This system has created problems for, U.S. citizens across our entire nation. And I know that I'm going to be calling this a broken system, but in all actuality, this system is not broken. This system was made this way. It is working perfectly fine. And people do not see a problem with it because it was created to do exactly what it is doing right now. And so I say a broken system because for some of us who live in the marginalized areas of our communities, this is broken. But for those who have privilege and are our oppressors, this is a perfect system that they want to continue to pull and push through for an eternity if they can. And so we are talking about the U.S. prison population and the prison system overall today. So when we open up to this documentary by Ava, she gives us the words of former President Obama, and he says the U.S. makes up only 5% of the entire world's population, but it accounts for 25% of the world's prisoners. That means that 1 out of 4 Americans are currently incarcerated within the U.S. prison system. And the U.S. prison population consists of 2.3 million individuals right now, currently. The U.S. has, as a result, the highest incarceration rate in the world. Not just in individual states, not just within our region of the world, but in the entire world, we have the highest incarceration rate. We are a system, a nation that loves prisons. We love to lock people up. So this brings us into the question, why is this a socially significant cultural problem? Throughout the documentary, we have people discussing why this is an issue. And these issues are related to overcrowding and expansion. We have prisons that are flooded with individual inmates to the point where they're damn near stacked up on each other. It's expensive. We fail to realize that the people who are paying for these prisons are us. It's coming out of our tax dollars. We're being taxed to run these prisons. We are being taxed to feed prisoners. We're being taxed to run equipment that is needed to make these prisons happen, that goes into building these prisons. We are funding the industrial prison complex, and that is problematic. Thirdly, it's rights limiting. Walking into the prison system automatically means that as an individual, you are no longer considered a citizen of the U.S. You are governmental property belonging to the U.S., and you are immediately stripped of your rights. And we'll talk about what some of those rights look like as we get through the slideshow. And so it brings us to the question, who chose this system? Who made this system happen? And we honestly have to go back into looking at a history of privilege and power versus that of oppression, because that is where this stems from. This is where we are. Criminal. You're going to see this flash throughout the entirety of the presentation, because this is a word that's commonly used throughout the documentary narrative, because who is and who isn't a criminal depends on how the system identifies and looks at you. The 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment states that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the U.S. or any place subject to their jurisdiction. We have to start with slavery here because, unfortunately, in this country, the 13th Amendment comes as a result of the end of slavery. As we all know, slavery was an economic system that, when demolished, it left the South in economic ruin. The 13th Amendment, as a result, allowed for a loophole that, when exploited, could rebuild the economy of the South. You have to understand that the Civil War, African Americans become arrested in mass, but as a result of the Civil War, the South is kind of tethered. The economic system is broken, and it leaves open, a cancer almost, where African Americans become the meat of that cancer. They get eaten alive by the system immediately following the end of the Civil War, where we see African Americans are no longer considered slaves, they're no longer considered property, but people who should have, full rights and access. However, who is going to fund the South if we don't have free slave labor? How will the planter elite make it if they cannot make it on the backs of individuals who they don't have to pay? So we open up an issue where African Americans become arrested in mass. This becomes a part of our first prison boom in the US. African Americans become immediately deemed as criminal and a threat. We talked exclusively about this in our previous presentation titled A Behavior Analysis on Institutional Racism in the U.S. If you are interested in learning more about how this process of criminal and threat can become identified with specific types of individuals, please go back and watch that specific live that we had on this particular slideshow and that presentation, because it definitely breaks this down. I don't want to break it down here because it's so much meat to unpack and we have to get into some other heavy things today. But what we see in this time, there's a change in Black archetypes and stereotypes supported in media and culture. We remove ourselves from this genteel African American person or spirit, and we change that stereotype into what becomes known as a criminal and a threat. Birth of a Nation was one of these films that kind of highlighted this culture, where we see that the stereotypes supported currently in our media of African Americans is really popularized throughout this film. As a result, we see a surge in white supremacists and terrorist organizations, specifically the Ku Klux Klan. What we find out in this documentary, and which I still find the most interesting, is prior to A Birth of a Nation, the KKK never once burned crosses in anyone's yard or anyone's field. They never did practices around burning crosses. However, as a result of The Birth of a Nation, that film revitalized the KKK and gave new identity to who they are. So now what we have become associated with in regards to the KKK is these burning crosses that were never once a part of their original culture or a part of their original identity. This is the power of film and art in our society, and media is a part of that. We see as a result of this documentary or this film, Birth of a Nation, there's an increase in Southern lynching and in violence against African Americans in the South begins to spark the Great Migration, which is the movement of people of color, specifically former slaves, into urban communities in the North and Midwestern areas in the West of the United States. And a lot of this violence that we see with the lynching is what prompts this change, which prompts this movement out of the South. The fear of being killed at any time and any day really urges African Americans to leave their homelands. A broken system looking at an institutional shift. We see that we go from a cultural change from illegal to legal forms of racist practices. This is what we have come to know now as institutional racism. We can look at this from its inception, starting with convict leasing. Of course, this is a process that immediately follows slavery. This becomes known as Black codes, where we are not giving former slaves their full rights, but instead we are using their bodies and criminalizing them so that they can do the work on previous lands that were once belonging to the planter elite. So you see these people become immediately released from the chains of slavery, only to be thrown back into the same institution under a different name. So this institutional shift takes what was, illegal. You can't legally own slaves anymore on paper, but we can then make this legal form of slavery, which is now taking someone who was once a slave, criminalizing some small act that they've done, and putting them back into chains and bondage, and then leasing them to old planter elite who used to have, whole plantations filled with slaves. And now they can just rent out slaves as they want, or former slaves, and make them do the work that they used to do prior to the release of slavery in 1865. We create a culture that is building in institutional racist practices just to sustain our economy in the South. This, of course, changes to Jim Crow laws and enforced segregation, where we have separate bathrooms, separate schools, separate resources for people of color versus the white community. And we know that those resources were not up to par in regards to our white counterparts at the time. And then, of course, voter discrimination and suppression laws. So we see this institutional change go from an illegal form to a more legal form of suppression, almost as if whatever victory that just preceded someone's culture or someone's identity in this country then gets replaced with something more heinous or equally heinous to keep the playing field from being leveled, to keep people from reaching access and resources. And this is where we have come to today with a prison population that is so massive as a result of creating more institutional barriers to prevent people from accessing their rights. The civil rights movement and activists come in. There's work being done. We see what we have identified as counterculture and fighting oppression. We talked a lot about counterculture in our previous presentation that you guys can find on our page online. But counterculture comes in as a way to reduce the likelihood of oppression. It comes to fight oppression. It comes to remove some of the controlling barriers that oppression puts on our backs. And as a result, we see activists become reduced to criminals for their willingness to fight and to be on the front lines, to engage efforts that are going to be more promising to the African American community. In this social activism, a lot of it is met with social change, in which we were able to garner the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, with an increase in crime around the U.S., we see that again, civil rights movement and civil rights activists become likened to criminals, saying, the civil rights movement is responsible for this additional crime in the United States. Even though that's unfounded, the association of such a thing can be so powerful that we begin to relate the civil rights movement and civil rights activists to that of criminals. And once we have identified someone as criminal, we can put them into a system that takes away their rights and remove their privileges as Americans. Mass incarceration starts in the 1970s. We see this substantial increase in prison incarcerations. This is where we first come in touch with the term mass incarceration. This is where we can actually start putting an identity and a name to a system that is occurring around us. This kind of rolls us into Nixon's era of law and order, in which crime becomes a codified term for race, and we go into what we see now in today as dog whistle politics, in which we can codify certain words or codify certain words. And in using those words, we can target certain people that we want to target for fear or for political gain, and we can make those people engage us in a certain way that isn't racist on the surface level, but underneath has racist undertones and practices that we can see that only a specific subgroup of our communities are being targeted. And then this talks brings us into economic resources for law enforcement, and doubled during this time under the Nixon era, that they were able to use law enforcement to tackle crime. So he's doubling law enforcement as a result of being able to garner this support, and he's able to say there's this emphasis on crime. Well, crime in this way is dog whistle politics to say we have a black problem. We have people who we do not like, and we want so badly to restrict their access that we need to go after these people. And crime is the issue that we're going to go after them under. In this way, we see a lot of urban communities being targeted. And by the end of 1970, we see that there are 357,292 inmates within the prison population here in the U.S. The war on drugs. The war on drugs is a way of looking at addiction and dependency as crimes. Prior to Nixon and his administration, we never looked at drugs so severely. Drugs were never a target for governmental control, not as heavy as Nixon comes in with these changes. However, he comes in and he coins this phrase, war on drugs, to kind of shift the narrative here, to say this is where our focus should be. So it's not just crime of any kind, it's specifically crimes related to drugs and addiction and independency. We see here there's an increase in minor drug offenses that become legally problematic with law enforcement. We see that there's an uptake in criminalization of people who are either selling drugs or using drugs. This goes into the Southern strategy here. Again, we're able to codify language. so that we can get our needs met. And this is done with the Southern strategy. Democrats are recruited into the Republican Party using codified language that is racially, charged with those racial undertones, and we're able to change a lot of the Democrats of the South into the Republican Party. And as a result, we have support for getting tough on crime politics, where racial bias becomes inherent within the system. By the end of 1980, we see that the prison population in the US has increased to 513,900 individuals. Following Nixon's, presidency, we come into an era of Reaganism. And Reagan enacts targeted strategies against the war on drugs. And instead of this metaphysical war where we say, okay, war on drugs is this thing, kind of like the war on terror is happening, but we can't really touch it. We can't taste it. Our five senses cannot engage it. Reagan makes the war on drugs an engaging war. This is where we see in 1982, we see the attacks that we are able to put into actual communities to fight this war on drugs. He was able to get his wife on with her Just Say No campaign. For all of us who were in the DARE program, God bless our souls. We definitely learned the song. We were a part of the soldiers almost to fight against drugs. I've read so many memes about the DARE program. They said DARE definitely prepared me more for drug encounters than I've even ever had in my entire life. I was so ready for someone to offer me random drugs on the streets because of the DARE program. Again, we moved this into a literal campaign almost, where we're able to say this is a real problem without any evidence of it really being a problem at all. In this, we see an increased poverty with significant number of Americans below the poverty line. A lot of this change within the war on drugs was just coming after individuals, who were impoverished. And instead of giving them help, we consider them criminals in our culture and our communities. And with this, we see an introduction of crack cocaine to the inner cities of our communities. And now we have something that's real that can be targeted within the actual war on drugs, so to speak, that does become problematic. We could go into the semantics of how the war on drugs worked under the Reagan administration. We know it's not as cut and dry as this. We know that we were funding the Nicaraguan war through the introduction of crack cocaine into urban communities, just because the U.S. didn't want to fund it themselves. We can get that deep into this discussion. But what is really important here is that we start to racialize certain drugs over others. Crack cocaine becomes a racialized drug when we're speaking in terms of who is using this drug. And in this case, African Americans become the targets because they're the predominant users of crack cocaine. Though in the documentary they say and state so many times that there was no real difference between crack cocaine versus powder cocaine other than the way that the drug was being treated, we still have what is known as a targeting, a racial targeting of certain individuals, where they are being targeted in this way to make them seem more criminal, even though they are not. So this is where we start to see that mandatory sentencing disparities are coming into play. There was like a 10-to-1 charge with crack versus powder cocaine. So for whatever offense you got for powder cocaine, if you were caught with crack cocaine in the same amount of grams, the same amount of use, or if you had something that was similar to that gram amount that came with powder cocaine in the form of crack, you saw that your sentence was 10 times that of someone who was being put away for powder cocaine. This meant that with mandatory sentencing, people were likely to spend almost their entire lives in prison for drugs. We see this tripling of drug-based law enforcement under the Reagan administration. We see an increased amount of arrests within Black and urban communities. And here we have where a war on drugs can play on political fears to help him again secure his reelection. So we see that, oh, well, we have all these arrests of African American individuals. They must be criminal. They must be. Yeah, Reagan is doing so awesome. We should reelect him for being able to increase these arrests and get these criminals off the streets. That fear that we were playing with on politicians and their constituencies really helped to secure his election, but it created an unnecessary fear around people of color. We see that by 1985, that the prison population has now increased to 759,100 inmates. Let's look at media and fear. I won't go too in depth with this because we've covered it in our previous presentation titled "A Behavior Analysis on Institutional Racism." You guys should definitely go to our page, watch that, because it's going to break this down so much more. And I don't want to spend a lot of time doing that here. But what we have come to know is that media is a social institution and it is a controlling agency. Skinner gives us that. Go back and watch, behavior analysis on institutional racism. You'll know what all that means. We are looking at here overrepresentation of Black minorities as criminals in media. I don't know about you, but as I stated before, I grew up watching Cops. My family loves the first 48, and cold case files are my life. I'll watch it all the time. However, when we were young, we didn't know that certain ideas of criminal were being fed to us primarily because of the reassociation again and again of those people in the media as criminals. We talk here about the racial threat perspective. In this way, we can see that the miseducation of the public by constantly focusing the lens on people of color being arrested, being targeted by the police, being put in the back of cop cars, being used as bodies to show what a criminal looks like in this country, leads us to miseducation in the public eye. It evokes this fear response that people of color, Black boys, Black men, Black people, we are aversive stimuli, something to be feared in this country. We see here throughout the documentary the use of the term super predators. This was a relationship in which we see politicians speak on the issues of urban crime and drug use through the lens of minority teens, in which they say, these minority teens, they are a major threat to our society. And specifically, we know how the Central Park Fives case goes, where we see that even Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were like, yeah, these super predators are a problem. They're killing people and they're hurting people. And we need to get these kids off the streets. Even though this wasn't a major, massive problem in our real communities, this is what is being touted because of the media and this ability to regenerate and create fear, around a subject and around the people who we shouldn't normally fear. We have this big case that I want to talk about within the documentary, the image of Willie Horton. You can go back and research Willie Horton within the documentary, but his image was able to play on archaic, primitive, white fear of Black men. He was a rapist and a murderer who was in prison. And throughout the documentary, they're pretty much stating that he was allowed to go on a pass just because of the former candidate for office at the time, Dukakis, had allowed weekend passes for certain inmates. While he was on a pass, he ended up murdering, I believe, a woman and her whole family. His image was put in so many different magazines, across media footage. His image as this scary Black man was able to be used as a way to play on the fears of white men and white families and white communities. Even though this isn't a common fear-based supported ideology, the use of his image and his face continue to support the need to be scared of Black men. So this fear was not substantiated or supported as a result of a real threat in American history. But when you can align something and associate a specific stimulus with a thing over and over again, it takes on the conditions, it takes on the characteristics of that thing. And the more that we align Black bodies with something to be feared, it takes on the conditions of fear. It takes on fear-like stimuli. However, in this country, we know that that isn't truly the narrative when it concerns Black men. The narrative that we should be pushing is talking about the fear that people have of white supremacy and how white supremacy has become so diabolical to American society. So this fear around Black men results in Bush Sr. attaining the presidency over Dukakis. This is something that we are visually able to see in the documentary. And this fear of Black bodies, it can then drive, and it did drive, the election outcomes when evoked in politics. Bush Sr. was great at using this stimulus of Willie Horton in his, his whole campaign. Party was able to use this stimulus of Willie Horton as a fear elicitor, and he was able to say, look at what Dukakis supports. I would never support this. We need to be more tough on crime. And as a result, he was able to be elected on the fears of white people. By the 1990s, we see that the prison population is at 1,179,200 inmates. Let's look at what we consider to be a new Jim Crow. One of the authors one of the historians within the documentary, she actually wrote this book titled A New Jim Crow. I, for the life of me, don't have her name at the tip of my tongue, but she's one of my favorite sociologists. Her work has been really monumental in outlining all of this stuff that we're talking about here and being able to see the institutional problem of subjugation in our culture. Looking at Bill Clinton's three strikes law is kind of where this new Jim Crow becomes played out. We see it. I think it's funny as a black person to be talking about Bill Clinton, because when I was growing up, I would always hear how Bill Clinton was so connected to the urban black core community. He was a black people's president. He was regarded as being black so many times himself. But if you really knew who Bill Clinton was at the time of his presidency, I don't think we would hold him in such high prestige. I want to talk about Bill Clinton's three strikes law. I grew up knowing what this law was, what it meant, and how it could be used as a tool of fear in our communities, specifically targeting black men. So, three strikes law significantly increases the prison sentence of persons convicted of a felony who have been previously convicted of two or more violent crimes or serious felonies themselves. So, in this regard, once you got three strikes, you were out. So, your first offense plus your second offense and your last offense were equivalent to you spending 25 to life in prison. There was rarely any time with three strikes law that once you hit your three strikes, you wouldn't be given a lifelong sentence for the rest of your remainder natural life in prison. This is some harsh, tough on crime policies here. And as a result, we see Bill Clinton become more tough on crime, more strict than his predecessor. Why was this such a theme? Why was this the trend to become more tough, more strict? So we see that with three strikes law, there is a severe limitation in the ability of offenders to receive anything other than a life sentence. That was the primary punishment. We see that that was the primary punishment. And with all of these changes, as that being the primary punishment, we see again increases in other institutional forms of subjugation where we see mandatory sentencing coming into play. This is significant. Mandatory sentencing completely removed the power of arbitrary rulings of judges. No longer were judges able to set limits on when a person was going to go to prison, how long they were going to go to prison for, and they weren't able to set those levels, those limits anymore, because this power was immediately removed from their hands and put into the hands of prosecutors, 95% at the time who were white. And so we see that mandatory minimums are imposed as a result, where truth in sentencing comes in, and the public gets the knowledge of being able to say, well, I want to know how long a person is going to be in prison. And truth in sentencing allows and forces in a lot of ways for a person, once they're sentenced, to carry out 85% of their sentence, mandated to do so. And then of course we see limits to parole, where people were not really able to make parole and be on probation as a result. So we create a system not only of fear, but of rights limits that prevent us from being able to even engage ourselves as citizens in the court of law, because we see what we're up against. This creates a towering presence in our justice system for anybody who's forced to face it, whether they be innocent or guilty. It creates a problematic experience in a problematic system that only further subjugates people who we consider our brothers and our sisters, our fellow Americans. This is further continued with, Bill Clinton's 1994 crime bill. It only gets worse. Again, I struggle to see how this man became the black people's president. Like, how does this man, with his three strikes law and his 1994 crime bill that targets urban communities and the black community, how does he become our president? How do we take on his identity and say that Bill Clinton's my brother? How? Not with this. Locking up our parents, and our brothers and our sisters, and our uncles and our aunts. Like, how does he become the voice of the people? And I'm going to say this because I can. As a black person, black people, we have got to wake the hell up. We have got to start seeing politicians for who they are through their actions instead of their words. His words were so poignant. Meanwhile, as he's talking to us, he's back wheeling doors of of marginalized, disenfranchising practices that are affecting our communities, black and brown communities. This is problematic. This is a problem within our culture and our community that we were left at the end holding the bag for. We've got to be better consumers of politicians. We've got to get involved in the systems. We have got to read the bills. We have got to become a part of the culture that has definitely made itself a part of us. We always talk about, I don't want to be in politics. I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to have my identity surrounding politics. Well, everything about our identities are political. And it has been since the inception of slavery, since the person got off the first boat that looked like us into this country. Everything about our identity has been political. We are politics. They have made so many rulings for or against us just based on our existence. How can you not be engaged in the political sphere? To not be engaged means to not care one damn about your life. So I say this because Bill Clinton was considered the black people's president. How? How could he be? The 1994 crime bill increases incarceration rates of racial minorities in the U.S. Funny, huh? Increases funding of police to implement militarization of the police. We get so up in arms about, thinking about Ferguson. How many tanks did we see in Ferguson? Well, at the death of Michael Brown. Tanks rolling down the street was something that I heard consistently. Well, this is what started with Bill Clinton. He increased the militarization of the police. He did so fairly easily, playing on fears, getting tough on crime. Again, with the 1994 crime bill, we see reinforcement in discriminatory policing practices that are abusive, that are intrusive, and punishment heavy. Those same practices are what we're dealing with today. What we're fighting against today, those are the same practices that just killed Dante Wright. Those are the same practices that just killed George Floyd. Why are we okay with this? Following all of these things, recently with Hillary Clinton going up against a lot of people when it came to her presidency, she was trying to get ahead of things. BLM addressed addressed his 1994 crime bill during her run for presidency. And I guess I would say their 1994 crime bill, because she was a heavy, staunch supporter of her husband's practices and her husband's laws. And we come to see that the Clintons, of course, are apologizing for their poor policy making. They're acknowledging, oh, this was problematic to the Black community. We did an injustice. But what in the hell are apologies without reformation? What are apologies without amendment? What are apologies without realized change? And that's a question that is brought up within the documentary. You can be apologetic, you can be remorseful, you can feel all the feelings. But if it doesn't come with any real change for real communities, is it really worth a damn? We see in 2000 that the U.S. prison population skyrockets to 2,015,300 inmates. At this time in 2001, African Americans within the prison population account for 878,400 of those inmates. It's a significant portion of African American people. And then by 2014, the U.S. prison population is at 2,306,200 inmates, which is roughly where it's at right now. Bill Clinton, y'all. This moves us into the meat and potatoes of what we are talking about today, y'all. This is where we are. 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 I see there are things in the comments. I want to go and address them as I go. Legends Foot Apparel, he says, are we speaking on racism leading to prison or in prison? And who's speaking on it has actually life experience in more than 30 seconds in the American prison system. Just wondering, as a convicted felon, with 7 years of actual life in direct in prison system, lived in prison system life, and would love to hear and share my experiences. However, it sounds like we are more likely discussing the process leading up to prison and jail and not actually experiencing the prison system. Would love to contribute. Awesome. Thank you, Legends. We are getting ready to get into some of the meat of that, and we're going to be talking about what happens once we're in the prison population, once someone enters it in. Yes, I will definitely totally post her name. She's in the 13th documentary. She's in there. I will definitely get her name to you. We're going to talk about this, and we're moving into that direction when we are engaging Alec. Talking about a broken system again, I want to talk about Alec. I put Trayvon Martin's face up here because his death should be on Alec's hands. Alec is directly responsible for his death, and I have no problem saying that because we need to start being honest and truthful about where the hell we are. Alec is responsible for Trayvon Martin's death. So is George Zimmerman. But Alec allowed an institutional process to come through the system to make his death more likely. And as a result, it protected his killer because of an institutional implied law that was in the system working, engaged. And that law has now transpired over to 23 states across this nation. 23 states. Stand Your Ground law is a Florida state law that allows one to kill in the act of self-defense. Trayvon Martin's death is a direct result of this law. If you need more information on Stand Your Ground law, please refer back to our behavioral analysis on institutional racism. It is on our page. It is up and running. You can engage it anytime you like. Educate yourself on what we're dealing with and what we're talking about in our communities. Alec, the American Legislative Exchange Council, is a political lobbying group. They write laws and give them to Republicans. Stand Your Ground was written by Alec. These are the direct words of one of the activists within the 13th documentary as he is expressing his anger, his frustration, his passion against this organization. The American Legislative Exchange Council, which doesn't even roll off the tongue, folks, it consists of politicians and corporations. I just want you to marinate on that. There is a group that exists of politicians and corporations. Why does that exist? Is my question. Those corporate members impose laws and they give them to political counterparts, most of which are Republicans. They then go in together, Republicans and these corporate members, and they vote on which of these laws are going to be pushed through the state, through the senators. Alec has been around for 4 decades, you guys. Technically, right now, as of this year, it has been around for 48 years, influencing laws throughout our nation. You aren't influencing the laws. Alec is. You think that you matter when you vote, as you should, but in some cases, there's an entire organization working behind our backs to push through legislation that is going to impact our real lives. And we, for a long time, knew nothing about it. But we've been dealing consequentially with every law it has pushed through for 48 years. Stand Your Ground was that law, one of many that it pushed through that allowed Trayvon's death to become an opportunity to further encroach on a group of people who are the most vulnerable in our society and our culture, a group that I belong to, a group that some of you may belong to. I went and researched a little bit more about Alec because I was pissed, right? Um, very pissed, as we all should be. We should all be very pissed. We should wake up pissed off, okay? So let's get into some things about Alec. Alec, we know you now. It is a 501c3. It was founded in 1973, so it's been around for approximately 48 years now as of this year. So far, they have gone through a lot of things. They have been targeting a lot of areas. They are targeting illegal immigration at this point. They are focused on loosening environmental regulations and protections to the EPA's, I'm sure, disgruntled nature. I'm sure that they're not very happy about that. They are working right now to weaken labor unions in the South because that's pretty much where all labor unions are after they've been pushed aside. They're opposing gun control. Nice to know. And they are currently aiding in voter suppression by pushing voter identification laws onto certain states. Texas has been a prominent state in which Alec has influenced and helped to create additional areas of voter suppression. They are prominently in full force in several states, those states being Arizona, Wisconsin, Colorado, Michigan, New Hampshire, and Maine. And approximately 200 model bills become law each year from this organization. 200 bills become law. Alec is touching 200 bills a year that are pushed to become law in our country. Not you, but Alec. Their bills benefit corporate funders such as Walmart. Walmart directly benefited from the Stand Your Ground law because they were one of the major sellers of ammo and guns within the states that had Stand Your Ground law. They directly benefited. And of course, Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, they were funding private prisons, and they too are part of ALEC. They made contracts with states for private prisons, reaping those profits. And when you're looking at a business model, for anybody who's done even like one business class, you know that when you are creating an institution or you're creating a product, that product has to be continually sold just so you can continue to make profits. Well, in this case, they're selling prisons. But prisons only bring in profit if and only if it is filled, hopefully to capacity. So in them engaging private prisons and giving them to the state for funding, they were ensuring that mass incarceration would continue. And of course, they had a hand in being able to increase and sustain mass incarceration through ALEC. SB 1070 is an ALEC bill that was pushed through by the CCA. It directly benefited the CCA. They allowed police to stop anyone who they believed was an illegal immigrant in Arizona. So, I mean, you could just look illegal. Which, I mean, what is illegal other than another form of criminal? And what is illegal other than another form of saying that a specific group of racially diverse people don't deserve access to rights and privileges? What's illegal other than Mexican or Latino? Black people get branded the term criminal. People who are Hispanic get branded the term illegal. They were able to increase detention centers, which are prisons, being honest, with immigrants, and CCA reaped the benefits and the profits of this bill. When SB 1070 was exposed, the CCA immediately left ALEC. But then they left them open with another corporation that also was invested in ensuring that profits are reaped from an institution as well. The American Bail Coalition, they are about privatizing probation and parole. They're able in this way to look at the potentiality of moving incarceration from without the prison system, moving it out of the prison system, and potentially into a home environment coming near you. So no longer will we be looking at the institution of prison itself, an actual structure that is built that houses inmates. Your home can now become the place where you were imprisoned. We literally just spent the last year being forced into our homes. A lot of us learned this year what it meant to not be able to see everybody, physically touch people, leave to go get a fresh breath of air at your favorite park sometimes because you're being told to not leave. I can't imagine someone for long periods of time being forced to stay in their home environment under duress and surveillance and thinking that their mental health is going to be okay. Why is it that the only form of reformation is just simply to move from one institution in cultural practice to just another severe institution in cultural practice? Why is this okay? So it's no longer slavery, it's no longer Jim Crow rules, it's no longer black codes, it's no longer the jails coming in and out. It's mass imprisonment. Oh, but then we could just go ahead and put you in incarceration at your home. Why does the system continue to create these reiterations of a problem instead of moving towards actual beneficial, real reform? The question here with ALEC is, should corporations and lawmakers be in bed together? I don't think so. I can't imagine anyone who really truly values democracy would think this is okay. We're going to keep going and talking about ALEC because let's look at what Missouri got going on, right? Because we live here, right? This is our state. Missourian leaders in ALEC. Let's say their names because I want you guys to know who they are. I love finding out who they are. It's good to know your enemies up front. So let's start with Sue Allen, a Republican for the Missouri House of Representatives. Jane Cunningham, a Republican with the Missouri Senate. Stanley Cox, Republican, Missouri House of Representatives. Scott Dicus, Missouri House of Representatives, a Republican. John Deal, Republican, Missouri House of Representatives. Tony Duggar, Republican, Missouri of Representatives, Missouri House of Representatives. Sue Inchlicher, Republican, Missouri of Representatives. Dave Henson, Missouri of Representatives. Tim Jones, Republican, Majority Leader, Missouri House of Representatives. Rob Mayer, President pro tempore, Missouri Senate. Cole McNary, Republican, Missouri House of Representatives. Kathleen Miners, Republican, Missouri House of Representatives. Brian Munslinger, Republican, Missouri Senate. Brian Nees, Republican, Missouri Senate. Mike Parson, Republican, the current Missouri governor. Marinate on that. Therese Sander, Republican, Missouri House of Representatives. Rodney Shad, Missouri House of Representatives. Vicki Schneider, Republican, Missouri House of Representatives. Jason T. Smith, a Republican, Missouri House of Representatives. Steve Tilley, Republican, Speaker of the Missouri House of Representatives. And Billy Pat Wright, a Republican, Missouri House of Representatives. Before we even move on, let's just go back because I want y'all to see. Mike Parsons is a member. He's actually identified on the site as an alumni. So, he graduated into the full bullshit of ALEC. He is here in our state, potentially taking kickbacks from corporations to move through bills that maybe we don't agree with, that aren't beneficial to his constituency, that aren't beneficial to Missouri and what our needs are, that only could possibly encroach on our rights. So many people have decided to remove themselves from ALEC just because of how damaging their reputation has become, not because it's a bad organization in their minds, but how damaging it was to be found out what ALEC has done in our culture and our society to further disenfranchise, to further aid in the murders, to further push through legislation that is not beneficial to the country as a whole. And here we are sitting as Missourians dealing with a man who has actively participated in this horrible organization. Mike Parson, we are not okay with you. This is problematic. What else are you doing behind Missourians' backs? Because one of the beneficial things about ALEC was that it was able to be secret until it wasn't. Until the country found out. What have you been doing behind Missouri's back? Are we next to have some law come through that could potentially kill our babies? Are we next? Mike Parson? The stand your ground laws come here? What else is next for us? Who do you think you are? I just had to say that respectfully. There's several corporations in ALEC, and this don't get pretty either. We've been talking about the corporations that are in ALEC that are supporting certain bills that become laws once they're voted on by the lawmakers that are also a part of this organization. I was making it down the list, and as I came down the list, I saw a couple of names that might interest Missourians. The first several are important as well. American Bail Coalition. This is everywhere. This is a national organization. The Bankers Association, the Council of Life Insurers. These are people that really can have so much power over us, just in their ability to promote now certain legislation, but also just because of who they are and the power that they've already are coming to the table with. And to know that this is where we are is problematic for us as voters, because what's happening when we're not in the booth? What's happening when we're not at the ballot? What's happening when we are putting our power into the hands of politicians who don't consider their constituency when they're making laws? Anheuser-Busch in Kansas City Power and Light. Why are you here? Why are you on this list? It makes me question everything that you've been doing and where your hands have been. I can see why corporations will want to belong to this organization, because who wouldn't want to be able to have the power to decide how legislation works to the benefit of your corporation? But when you're found out, there's hell to pay. Because now I want to know why you're on this list. And what scheming things have you been doing behind our backs? And I specifically say this at Kansas City Power and Light, who a lot of us in Kansas City are paying money to support our electricity. What are you doing behind our backs? Why are you in this group? Kansas City, we need to wake up. St. Louis, we need to wake up. Are they potentially pushing through bills that can harm our community while feeding off of us at the same damn time? How dare they? How dare they be on this list? You have some explaining to do. There are several laws that are being supported by ALEC and have been supported by ALEC for a while. Stand your ground laws are just one of many. Truth in sentencing, which required that an individual who is an inmate spend at least 85% of their sentence in prison, was also one of those laws touted during the Bill Clinton administration. Three strikes law, that's an ALEC law, Bill Clinton administration. Mandatory minimums, ALEC law. Right to work bills are ALEC laws. This completely just removes the support of unions and their ability to negotiate wages, workers' rights. It just removes them from being able to do the work. Why are you okay with having your name on this garbage? Living wage mandates with Preemption Act. This was the most devastating, because what this does for people who are in Atlanta, Georgia, they have passed a law saying that it will only use taxpayer money to hire contractors who pay living wages. But the state legislature there passed an ALEC bill that was handed to them and voted on in secrecy to ban the city from being able to control its own damn wage limits. If the taxpayers want something, shouldn't it be given to them? If the taxpayers stand to benefit, shouldn't it be given to them? I thought it was we, the people, not we, the corporations, not we, the politicians, not we, the ALEC. It's we, the people. We should be controlling what happens to us. This is our government. But then you pass these bills that are not beneficial to your constituency. Texas voter ID laws, those are ALEC bills. And again, the SB 1070, which focuses so highly on immigration and detention centers for kids and families seeking a better life in this country. Labeling them illegal, throwing them away for God knows how long. These are ALEC bills. These are ALEC laws. There's links here I'm willing to share with you guys. Just let me get myself together, because like I've been ready to fight. I've been ready. Let's go. This is despicable. This is problematic in our culture. I'm going to talk a little bit about the prison industrial complex. I know that um, someone in the comments, and I really want to go back to that comment. I'm scrolling down. Legends Foot Apparel. This is where I think we're going to address what happens once you're in the prison industrial complex, once you're an inmate, once your rights have been stripped. What happens to you? Something we have got to talk about. The prison industrial complex includes the privatization of the prisons and the vendors that profit from the prison system. It requires mass incarceration to sustain profits. Remember, without mass incarceration, you have no profits. Mass incarceration needs to be continued within the prison industrial complex just so it can be sustained. There are networks of benefactors that reap profits from the services and products offered within the prison system. Vendors, these private companies and corporations that possess a state-approved contract, they supply a service or a product within this prison system, usually at a really inflated price, you guys. And that price is so inflated that it's nothing like what we will see out here in our communities. It's not something that they would even begin to try to offer us. But in the prison system, where services and goods are just so lacking, people are willing to do anything to be able to make a phone call, to have, snacks and food, that they can inflate this price and someone will still pay that. Contracts are provided for extended long periods of time. As a result of this, payment from the state is guaranteed, regardless of whether or not those services are provided or rendered. Airmark, we have to talk about it. Just my own experiences with me just knowing Airmark. I used to work at a halfway house detox center downtown Kansas City. It was my first big girl job. I was 19 years old. I had no business working there. I was too inexperienced. But I was responsible for overseeing my clients' day-to-day operations and activities. I would take my clients from one building to the next to go get dinner, lunch, breakfast, whatever time of day it happened to be, and whatever meal was being offered at the time. I was able to take them over to the next door to the cafeteria. We had a contract with Airmark. The food was god awful. They would give them cold meat. They would give them stale bread. They would give them things that looked like they had been molted and molded in the refrigerator for like overnight. I complained about it, and my complaints just kind of went unanswered. I found out that the contract that Airmark was providing to the state through our funding, all of that mess, was so low that it only allotted for certain amounts of food or certain types of food. Airmark. This made no sense to me because I would also spend a lot of time in the summers at Starlight Theater, one of my favorite places to go with me and my best friend Darrell. We would go watch all the nice musicals. And the food there that was served to us was from Airmark as well. Most of the vendors used Airmark as a food provider, food service provider. And the food was so great. The chicken strips were warm, the hamburgers were nice. It was expensive, but it was good food. I couldn't figure out the life of me, like, why was Airmark's food at the Starlight Theater so much better than at my workplace downtown? Well, these contracts is why. The state can either have a really low contract or they can have a really high one. Whoever the vendor is that's allowing this, product to come through determines how they're going to, what product they're going to get. The prison industrial complex must not have really high contracts, because Aramark has shown now to have reports of maggots within the food across several states, and people have been getting sick. Same thing with Securus. They provide telephone services. A year previous to the release of this documentary, they had made $114 million in profits, trumping up the charges of a 10-minute phone call. You would have to work for minimum wage an hour and a half to be able to afford a 10-minute phone call through Securus in the prison system. Horizon Health. They are providing health care services in at least 28 different states across the U.S., but they've had health-related deaths due to reports of negligence and failure to provide appropriate health management to inmates. Why? Why do we have a system that allows our prisoners to be treated like crap and allow these corporations to reap and suck off at the taxpayers' expense from us? They are taking from us through these state contracts that are from our tax dollars, and they're just sucking us dry. They're not providing quality services in the prison system. So what's happening is people are giving shitty service and products to American citizens who have been deemed unfit for their rights in this system. They give them the crappiest of crap that costs no money, and then they pocket these profits from the state. And these contracts go uninterrupted for years, I'm assuming decades. The National Correctional Industries Association, which is a thing that we hear the most about, American prison labor. They are the individual corporation that's responsible for a lot of this American prison labor. Inmates are significantly underpaid, if they're paid at all, providing slave labor. We joke a lot in my family, like, I work this job, I earn slave wages. Well, no, that's somebody who's actually earning slave wages, if any at all. And a lot of our goods and our products and our services through these corporations are being provided through slave labor in the prison system. J.C. Penney and Victoria's Secret were one of those people, and as soon as everybody found out about them, they jumped ship. Once everybody said, your supplier is who? Who supplies you? Bob, doing 5 to 10 years of supplying you? Found out a lot of the Idaho potatoes that are being produced by that corporation are being planted and harvested by inmates. The question then becomes, how can we unpack a system that has become this economically entrenched? Can we get rid of the prison complex if it's this much money in it? I want to take a good look here at Kalief Browder. I've talked about him a lot, specifically within our previous presentation on the behavior analysis of institutional racism. Like I've been saying, if you haven't heard of it, you haven't watched it, please go watch it, because it's more of this. It's more engaging in the way that it provides a true breakdown of how this system has come to be. Kalief Browder, if you don't know about his story, he is the poster child of prison reform. We're going to talk a little bit in detail about his case, but not too much. He was pulled over by someone who had identified him as the potential robber of a backpack 2 weeks prior to him being picked up. He was leaving a party. He was like 16 years old. I want to talk about intersectionality in poor criminal justice policies because Kalief's case is special. All of the issues that the criminal justice system embodies, they all collided in this one kid's case, creating what I've called a perfect storm leading to his death. thinking about intersectionality, we have to think about race and poverty, because this is where those two areas, they combine and they collide. Being a person of color, you're more likely to also be impoverished because of lack of resources, lack of education, lack of opportunity that our white counterparts just, they don't suffer from. When you are impoverished, you're likely to live in a community that is just ravished by poverty and lack of resources, lack of opportunity, just lack. It creates a competition amongst people who are poor, which of course you see more crime. And when we see more crime in this country because of a history of dealing with it a certain way, with extra cops, extra law enforcement, extra, brutality, we have what becomes over policing in poor and urban communities of color. This is where law and government as a controlling agency steps in. We talked a lot about it in, a behavior analysis of institutional racism. If I haven't told you yet, you should go watch it because it's kind of dope. We see here that stop and frisk law that have been supported again by Republican politicians and lawmakers in New York. It all resulted in this perfect storm. Khalif was walking home at the age of 16 from a party like at 10 o'clock at night. He was with a friend, and somebody riding around with a cop in the back car says, "This is the guy. He stole my backpack 2 weeks ago, last week, 3 days ago. I can't remember, but he stole my backpack." And because of stop and frisk law, they pull him over and they're able to accost him without even having so much as probable cause to put him in the back of the police car and take him to the precinct. Khalif is 16 at this point. Another area of the perfect storm comes rolling in because state law in New York, you do not have to have a parent or a guardian with you when you're being interrogated at the age of 16. You don't need it. So this 16-year-old boy is being accosted by law enforcement in an interrogation room, not fully knowing his rights, not fully aware of the prison system that he's getting ready to walk into, unaware of what's to happen next for him. He's a kid. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to make bail because his mom couldn't afford it. And not only was she not able to afford it, because he had on his record a previous felony that he had gotten as a younger kid, because criminalization of children in New York is high, he wasn't able to make bail after several weeks of it being posted. They completely removed the opportunity off the table. So even though she wasn't able to make bail at first, initially with him going into the jail cell, into the prison or the jail itself, she was able to get the money a couple of weeks after. But because they had completely removed it because of his previous felony, she couldn't take the money that she had scraped together to go bail him out. As a result, he was looking at being in prison for a long time. So when we look at bail, like if you're too poor, you can't make bail, then you have to stay in the jailhouse. That's the way it works here. If you're innocent, then you'll be able to pay, right? This brings us into plea bargains. Khalif refused to take a plea bargain. They're pretty much telling him that, taking a plea bargain would be beneficial to you. You probably won't be in prison for too long, just but a few years or a year. And Khalif was like, I did nothing wrong. I don't know this guy. I didn't steal a backpack. I don't know what's happening, but I didn't do it. With plea bargains, mandatory minimums in prison makes going to trial to plead your case an intimidating alternative. But Khalif wanted to do it anyway because he just believes so much in his innocence. It's to the point that 97% of inmates that are currently in prison right now in the system, they have plea bargained themselves there to reduce the likelihood of lifelong lengthy sentences as a result of mandatory minimums in this country. Plea bargains are considered more desirable outcomes because you get to go home sooner. But you also leave the prison system with a felony on your record. And that felony will limit your job opportunities once you're released. It will limit your access to housing and student loans. It will limit your voting rights, which is one of the most significant rights that you have. And it just creates another barrier of reintegration back into the general public. He refuses the plea deal, and as a result, the prison system punishes him severely. He spends 3 years on Rikers Island. 14 months of that he spends in solitary confinement. He never was once charged with a crime for 3 long years. And another reason for that is primarily because of how New York State works. They can keep prolonging your case to gather evidence because they have an influx of inmates coming in that they can't even take everyone to trial quick enough with the amount of people coming in that are needing to be arraigned and sent through the due process of trial if they choose that. They can't even keep up with the influx of inmates that are coming in. There's no representation that can get them in fast enough to plead their case. So he sat there for 3 years not being charged with the crime, waiting on his day in court that never really came. 2 years after being released from the prison system, he commits suicide because while he was in there, he went through mental health torment, being attacked by guards, having prisoners attack him, trying to defend himself because he was so different. And because he just wanted to fight his case, the inmates in there made it very difficult for him to do so. And all these, I mean, and the officers did too. And I want to say this, the officers were not all white people. A lot of them were black men. Because you don't need to be white to make this system work. You just have to be ingrained in it. You just have to be a part of it. This form of institutional racism is just so brutal. In the documentary, they asked the question, who should be running the prison system? They say that the people currently running the system shouldn't be the ones running it. It should be people who have knowledge of human behavior. It should be the social workers. It should be the behavior analysts. It should be the counselors and the therapists. It should be the caseworkers and the management. But we aren't the ones running the prison system. Police are. Officers of the law are running the prison system. Correctional officers. And that's a problem. Currently, right now, there is a new prison reform bill. And this is important. It's called the First Step Act. It's one of the latest prison reform bills to combat issues related to the effects of mass incarceration here in the U.S. It was signed by Donald Trump on December 18th of 2020. It is a collective bipartisan legislation effort to just improve criminal justice outcomes. It tackles two important areas of reform: sentencing and prison reform overall. Sentencing is just there to reduce the mandatory minimum sentencing policies and giving judges back their freedom to actually set mandates. Again, minimum and mandatory sentencing was so problematic during Bill Clinton's administration. So now they're trying to give judges back that freedom so that they can sign those sentences. And currently, any offenders who have drug-related cases prior to 2010, they can apply for shorter sentencing through a resentencing application program. And prison reform. There's changes to incarceration-based practices. One of those changes is just reducing inhumane punishing practices, such as minimizing the use of restraint with certain populations. One of the populations that they were focused on was pregnant women in prison. So it made me question, you mean to tell me you were restraining pregnant women in prison this entire time? Pregnant women were being restrained. There's also been this increased focus on rehabilitation versus punishment, which we should have known better. This is a question I have because the documentary just leaves you wanting like more. Is this change real? Is this a change that we can trust as American citizens? There's a lot of bipartisan efforts right now to reduce mass incarceration on the horizon. There's going to be more to come. A lot of celebrities have now jumped on the mass incarceration, prison reform train, and it's awesome, it's great. But can we trust those who have helped steamroll through our communities in the past? Can we trust them to do good work now? Are these changes for the good of Black and brown communities who are the most subjugated, the most marginalized within this system? Is it beneficial to us? Who benefits? And if we're not talking reform in a positive way, we could also be talking about reform in a regressive way as well. So, what is the potential next, reiteration of the criminal justice system? What's next? Is it home surveillance, footage in our homes as we have bracelets and wristbands and ankle monitors, heat sensory movement on, what is next? What are they going to do next? How is the criminal justice system going to evolve next? What does reform look like? I leave this here with you guys. 1 in 17 white men, as documented in the documentary, can be expected to go to prison in their lifetime. 1 in 3 Black men can be expected to go to prison in their lifetime. That's a staunch difference. Name 3 Black men you know right now in your name, and then you choose one of them to go to prison. That is the likelihood for African American men. 40.2% of the U.S. prison population consists of Black men, even though Black men only make up 6.5% of the U.S. population as a whole. That's because Black people only make up 13 to 15% of the U.S. population. And half of the African American population is women. But yet, Black men consist of 40.2% of the prison population here in the U.S. That's ridiculous. More Black people are under prison surveillance at this time in our history than the slave population of all the 1850s. That's a statistic that was released by the documentary of 13th. Review the 13th Amendment again. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. This loophole has created so many problems for us that now unpacking them requires a military service amount of people to come through and undo this work, undo this system. I say this because we are not removed from Jim Crow. We are living through an extension of the long arm of its oppression. And we are dealing with it and living through it right now. Thank you guys for being here. And as always, the way I like to end these presentations, just want to thank you guys and just want you to remember that Black Lives Matter. Today, tomorrow, next week, always. And just want to tell Dante Wright's family that we're with them, praying with them, and may he rest in power. Thank you guys.